This is episode 35 of the Discipleship Directives with Dr. Dan Crawford. I am your host, Vidal, and we welcome you guys to our podcast. Dr. Crawford, he is the president and founder of DiscipleAllNations.org. Also, Dr. Crawford is the professor emeritus for the Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Evangelism and Discipleship as well. Brother Crawford, thank you for being here today. We always enjoy your company, and today is an exciting podcast for me, and I'll tell you why. It's always exciting, but specifically today, I'm a lover of preaching and teaching, as you know, and that was exactly the topic that you brought us on the last session here in South Texas. So for the sake of those who may not have been able to attend, I'd love for you to expand and take us into some of the principles that you brought us on your teaching.
Sure. The idea being that these are principles for preaching, but they're also principles for teaching. So whether you are delivering a sermon or whether you're in a room teaching a small group of people in Bible study or whatever the circumstances are, these principles apply. And they're kind of hammered out over years of experience, and they probably won't work for everybody. But here's some helps that I was giving to the people that were present in the last teaching session. One thing is that I heard somewhere early on in my studies that every sermon is about just one word. So let's say you're going to preach on something like, and not every sermon needs a title, but you need a title in your mind, whether you have a printed title or not. Let's say you're going to preach on the amazing love of Jesus. Well, love is your key word. So that word appears in every sub-point. And again, not every sermon has points. Sometimes they call it bullets. Sometimes it's just themes. But if you're going to get up and talk for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, or an hour, you've got to have some sub-somethings, whatever you call them. And so every one of those has the word love in it. So maybe your first idea is that the Father and the Son loved each other from the beginning, which is what Jesus said. The Father loved me before the foundation of the earth. And then you got another idea you're going to talk about maybe on into the sermon or Bible study that love is what drove Jesus to the cross. Greater love has no man than this, man lay down his life for his friends. So each one, love is in the subtitle or the sub-point, which gives you continuity and helps you avoid what some of us have trouble with, you call it chasing rabbits, or just taking off on another subject when you're really supposed to be preaching on God's love. So you put the same word in every sub-point or subtitle, whatever you call them. The other thing is that every one of those ideas, points, whatever, would include three things: explanation, application, illustration. In other words, what does it say? What does it mean? What does it look like?
Okay.
Yeah. So, I've heard different ways that people talk about tell them what it says, tell them what it means, or tell them what it means and then tell them why it means that, or, different things. But for me, every time I have a different point in a sermon, I want to say, this is what the Bible says. That doesn't change. This is what it says right here. And this is what it means. Here's the application of that. And by the way, here's an illustration. And we learn, those of us who teach and preach, that personal illustrations are really good. Because you may be going along and people you're wondering if they're still with me or not. And then you say, the other day, and they're back. There's something about a personal story that attracts the people. Well, you can't use personal illustrations all the time because you run out of personal illustrations and people start wondering, did that really happen to him? Or did he steal that from somebody else? But, at least in every presentation, there's some kind of personal application to it or illustration of it. So those three things appear. So that's basically what it is. One word, what is it you're preaching on, teaching on? when I took preaching in college and in seminary, we talked about central idea of the text, CIT. I am so glad that somebody along the way changed that and started talking about the sermon in a sentence. Because that communicates a whole lot better.
Yeah.
Oh, by the way, my central idea of the text, and everybody's going, oh. But you say, okay, here's the sermon in a sentence. And usually, the first Sunday I'm in a church where I'm going to preach several times, I will say, I'm going to give you a sermon in the sentence in every one, because some of you are going to fade out here, and you're not going to stay with me through the sermon or the Bible study. So here it is. Get this, and you've got what I'm going to say. And again, it is the central idea of the text. It's just put into one sentence. Here's my message for today. So those are the basics.
Well, this is extremely helpful because, as you said before, a lot of times as pastors, the challenge is not content. The challenge is to be objective and to maximize our time or to avoid chasing rabbits. So obviously, the one point sermon, the one central idea, sermon in a sentence definitely is very, very helpful. You also spoke for a few minutes of a sermon or teaching session within your presentation. Remind us what you said on that.
Well, let's see. What did I say? I gave a couple of sample sermons just to show this is how it looks when I try to put these principles.
Is this the part where you spoke of capturing the audience,
the attention of
your
audience
in the first 2 minutes?
Yeah. And I've read several different theories on that. All of them are 2 minutes or less, which says whether you're preaching or teaching, you've got 2 minutes or less to capture your audience. So don't spend your first minute telling a joke, or unless that's what you're using to capture your audience. But don't wander around. Don't get up and tell them that you don't feel good today or something like that. You've got 2 minutes to capture your audience. And if you don't capture your audience in the first 2 minutes, you spend the rest of your time trying to capture your audience. And you don't need to do that. You need to know that you've got your audience. They're listening. They may fade in and out on you. And they may get up and go out for whatever reason, but you've got your audience. But you've got 2 minutes to do that.
Typically, in your case, can you remind us maybe in your last few sermons where you have put that into practice? How do you typically do that?
I don't know whether I even shared this, but there are several different things you can do. One is to ask a question that they would think about.
Okay.
Do you remember the tornado we had last week? Aha. Another thing is to make some kind of profound statement that would cause them to stop and think. So, things like that. Now,
Sure.
Recent sermon, I preached on Barnabas. And I started out with Elvis.
Elvis. Okay.
Elvis.
Okay.
And I said, now those of you my age and close will understand who Elvis is.
Sure.
But you younger ones are going to have to listen in here because you may not remember Elvis, except your grandparents talked about him. But Elvis Presley was obviously a star. And his practice was to come in the servant's entrance to the auditorium or the stadium or wherever he was singing. And the word would begin to spread, Elvis is in the house. And so he capitalized on that by waiting until that had filled the whole place. People turning each other and say, Elvis is in the house. Elvis is in the house. And then the announcer would come out and say, ladies and gentlemen, Elvis is in the house. And he'd come out, and of course the place would go berserk, and teenage girls would faint and all this kind of stuff. And I'd say, by the way, I started out saying, I want to introduce you to two people today. The first one was named Elvis. Okay. The second person I want to introduce you is a guy named Barnabas. He's in the book of Acts. We don't know a whole lot about Barnabas, but that's a name his mother gave him, but very few people called him by that kind of name because he was nicknamed the son of encouragement. with bar, son of, encouragement. And then I talk a little bit about Barnabas. And then my question is, actually the title of the sermon. So my big question today is there a Barnabas in the house?
Mm-hmm.
Then I would go to 4 places in the book of Acts where it talks about Barnabas, that the church needed Barnabas. They needed encouragement. Paul needed Barnabas. The church didn't like him because he was the persecutor of Christians, but Barnabas comes along. The missionary advance needed a Barnabas. When the Gentiles were getting saved, the church said, we don't know about these people. Let's send Barnabas down there to check on them. If he had come back and said, not those rascals, it would have killed the advancement of Christianity.
Yeah.
And the 4th one was John Mark needed a Barnabas.
That's right.
Because they split after the first missionary journey, disagreement. Paul takes Silas, Barnabas takes John Mark. But at the end, when Paul is dying, he sends word through Timothy, bring me John Mark. He would be helpful for me. Something happened. We don't know exactly what happened.
Yeah.
But John Mark needed Barnabas. So and with each one of those, is there a Barnabas in the house anywhere?
That's memorable.
So
that's memorable.
You would think.
Yeah.
And the starting, I've got 2 people to introduce you to today. Elvis. As the years go by, that's working less and less.
I was going to say that. I was going to say that for anybody that probably, in their 40s or so, is going to have to make an extra effort, to contextualize that. But
they've probably heard of Elvis.
Okay, yeah. Elvis still,
and so the point was that one of his methods was to let this question, is there an Elvis in the house? And then to translate that over to, is there a Barnabas in the house?
Yeah. That definitely will.
So that's a sample.
So in the Hispanic community, we have, or there is, a specific date where teachers are honored and celebrated.
Yeah.
It's a day of the teacher. In the conference, you mentioned of those that you remember that you were honoring, and specifically within your seminary training. Did you see these principles illustrated? Did you see them? Did you experience? How is it that professors in seminary kept your attention?
Yeah, I mentioned that actually I worked on this during what we have as Teacher Appreciation Week. And I'd mentioned that different levels of my education, and elementary school teacher that I was impressed with, and a coach in junior high and so forth. Got to seminary, there were 2. It was a tie. And one of them was Dr. Cal Guy, a missions professor, and then Dr. Roy Fish, evangelism professor. Dr. Guy would come into class carrying a letter. This was before emails, obviously. And he got volumes of letters from missionaries, most of whom were former students. I get them on email and text messages. He would have a letter. And he would begin class just by reading that letter. And he'd start crying. Very seldom did he get through a letter without crying. In fact, the joke was, you going to take that course? Yeah, it's Cry with Guy. It's Dr. Cal Guy.
He did it every time?
Best I remember, every class period began with a letter. Now, he's teaching missions. So he got our attention with a letter, because we were all anxious to know, where's that from? Who is that? And then he'd tell us whatever. And then he'd go into his lecture on missions. Oftentimes it would relate right back to something that he read in that
the letter.
Dr. Fish, I don't know, fortunately or unfortunately, my first semester in seminary was his first semester on the faculty. And he had very few notes. He would come into class singing. And I only tried that once, and I knew if I did that, the class was dismissed. So,
the presence of the Lord has departed.
I didn't capture anybody's attention. But I did use that method down the line, when I knew I had people in class who were music students, and particularly in that course where we were sending students out to preach revival meetings, there was J. Edwin Orr wrote a hymn that we don't even sing anymore about Lord, send revival and let it begin in me, and something like that. And I would have the music student begin the class, just start out singing that.
Mm.
But Dr. Fish would sing, and he wasn't the best singer, but he could carry the tune. And it would always be some praise, some uplifting song.
Mm-hmm.
And it got our attention. And we knew not to bother him by singing along. Just let him sing.
So he will sing by himself.
Yeah. And then he might, give it this or something, and we'd start singing along. But that's the way he got our attention. So those two professors had this unique method of starting class versus the professor that just kind of walks in, looks around, checks the roll a while, and you're going, come on.
Would you say, looking back, and obviously you got to know some of these professors, would you say that part of their methodology or strategy, it was simply a doxology? It was simply recognizing and honoring God, whether it's through the singing or reading a letter that, man, that's powerful.
Sure. And of course, this was seminary level training.
Sure.
You didn't get this in high school.
Of course.
Unless you went to a Christian high school, maybe, but I didn't. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it worked because you remember.
Sure, yeah.
You remember those moments.
And I also remember some of the professors that were as boring as it could be. And bless their hearts. They knew what they were talking about, but the delivery was just...
It was painful.
Painful.
It was painful.
Yeah.
But that's part of the training. I mean, you don't get to pick and choose, I mean, that's part of the training. You have to deal with everything.
Well, and some subjects are harder to be excited about than others.
That's also true. That's also true.
With me, those were the two subjects I was most excited about. So it wasn't hard for me to be captured at the beginning. Yeah. You were looking forward to that when you were going. There were some other classes that I was not as excited about, but they were required. They were required, and you had to go through them. That's right. Well, if you can fast forward the tape, the experience, now you are in South Texas serving as a student minister within the Pan American College back then. Yeah. It was college. And you had opportunities to preach in local churches back then. Yes. Anything that you might remember from those days? Any experiences that you can bring back into the experience of preaching and teaching? I don't know if this would help anybody. I think it was First Baptist in Alamo. It could have been First Baptist San Juan. But the pastor was gone for some reason, and he asked me to preach Sunday morning and Sunday night. Everybody had Sunday night services back then. So Sunday night, the minister of music announced that this is going to be Sing Your Favorites night. So, and of course we had hymn books. This was before even PowerPoint or anything. Everybody had a hymn book. And so he just called out a number. And we're going to sing the first and last verse of every song you want to sing. And then we turn it over to Brother Crawford. So this went on for 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes. People calling out their favorite numbers, and you can imagine what we sang, all the favorites. And finally he said, all right, everybody sit down. We're going to do one more. First and last verse. And turn it over to Brother Crawford. From the back of the auditorium. 500 and something of it. I'm going, oh my goodness. You know what's in the 500 numbers? Like the sevenfold amen or something like that. I'm thinking, oh no, what is this? And it was obviously a teenage boy that called it out. What is it? It was the Star Spangled Banner. That's right. So now we've just been seated. Everybody has to stand up. Stand up. And I doubt if anybody in there had ever sung the last verse of the Star Spangled Banner before. It was quite an experience. And then I had to get up and preach. And, some people were laughing and some people were weeping, tears of happiness. Mm-hmm. And I think the teenage boy had already left. He took off out the back door. But it was, you know, just one of those memorable experiences that
Most definitely.
I've never had anywhere else. Nobody else ever called out the Star Spangled Banner.
Well, I guess once you open those, I remember those practices when people were just calling out hymns, and and number one, you had to have proficient pianist or organist that can actually play anything. In any moment, right? And God bless those individuals. Our kids recently graduated from college and seminary, and we went through some of those favorite hymns, you know, with the pipe organ and all that, and that was a good reminder on that. Dr. Crawford, we're always glad to have you and you know, to be under the exposition of the Bible. This topic of preaching and teaching is extremely important. We can argue. And we're in a drought of, you know, the scriptures. And in our previous podcast, we spoke of the struggles of having pastors and, you know, calling out the call. We spoke of that as well. So I want to thank you for spending time with us and spending time in a subject that is so crucial. And may the Lord use this time and your teaching to remind us, for the ones who are still doing it, to remind us and, again, refocus our attention. But for those who need to respond to the call, that may the Lord use that. But specifically in your case, you continue to shepherd and to serve as an interim pastor. And I know you have said the number before. This is your interim number 29. What that entails is basically you keep on preaching. And you earlier mentioned your sermon of, you know, if there's a Barnabas in the house. So thank you for your faithfulness. Thank you for everything that you do. And we'll see you next time in our podcast. God bless. This is episode number 3 Discipleship. This is a Directives podcast and Dr. Crawford. I'm here this morning. Dr. Crawford, how are you?